Hello, my dear friends. If you have watched the video, The Most Bizarre Sexual Practices of Ancient Egyptian Pharaohs, then this will be the answer to the question, how pharaohs controlled female sexuality through religion. They were called daughters of the gods, but their bodies belonged to Pharaoh. In ancient Egypt, religion did not provide women with protection, but rather a cage. Behind every sacred chant was a law that forced them to remain pure. Behind every temple wall was a man who decided how much they were allowed to desire, love, or dream. Sex was not something women could control, but something Pharaoh controlled. Tonight, we will enter a world where religious belief became a weapon that Pharaoh used to stifle women's freedom. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background. And let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you ever believed that ancient religious ceremonies were private prayers whispered in dark corners of a temple, you might be unsettled to know that one of the most sacred rituals in ancient Egypt involved a woman, a pharaoh, and a public performance of divine union. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was considered the living embodiment of a god, and gods, according to Egyptian belief, needed to reproduce to maintain the balance of the universe. So pharaohs did the same. The ritual that made this possible was called the sacred marriage. It was not a symbolic act. It was physical, structured, and revered. In certain temples, once a year or more, the pharaoh would engage in sexual union with a priestess, chosen not for affection but for her sacred role. The setting was often a side chamber near the sanctum of the god Amun or Osiris. The floors were cleaned with perfumed oils, the linens freshly changed, and the doorways guarded by officials who ensured silence. This was not entertainment. This was fertility, order, and cosmic harmony all being reenacted through a human body. Apparently, divine consent was easy to obtain as long as it came from a man wearing gold and a crown. The woman had no say in this selection. She was chosen by high priests, confirmed through omens and rituals, and declared to be blessed with the responsibility of receiving the god's essence. That essence came in the form of the pharaoh, dressed in ceremonial robes, his body painted in gold, his head adorned with symbols of divine power. The act itself was not meant to be hidden, it was expected. Sometimes, it was even witnessed by select members of the priesthood. There was no illusion of privacy. Privacy was not part of a sacred duty. The priestess was often young, unmarried, and had undergone a series of cleansing rituals before being considered pure enough for the event. These rituals could last days. She would fast. She would bathe in lotus water. She would be isolated from other women. When the moment came, she would lie on the bed in a chamber lit by oil lamps, with incense curling toward the ceiling. Her breath slowed not from intimacy, but from preparation. Her silence was not romantic. It was expected. It is difficult to imagine a modern head of state announcing that national stability depends on a publicly sanctioned bedroom schedule. To the people of ancient Egypt, this was not immoral. It was necessary. The land depended on fertility. The Nile needed to flood. The crops needed to grow. The people needed children. All of this, they believed, began with divine union. By performing the sacred act, the pharaoh was not satisfying his desire. He was activating cosmic order. If the ritual was performed correctly, it was said that the gods would bless the land with prosperity. If it were not, drought might follow. Sometimes, the priestess would conceive. If she did, the child was not considered ordinary. Even if the pharaoh already had heirs, this particular offspring would be marked as special, touched by divinity, and often raised within temple grounds. If she did not conceive, she would return to temple service, perhaps chosen again the next year. Her role was not defined by love or legacy. It was measured by obedience, purity, and submission. This ritual was not the only one of its kind. It was, however, the most institutionalized. There were versions of it across different cult centers such as Thebes, Heliopolis, and Memphis. Each region adapted the myth of divine union to its own local gods, but the structure remained the same. A male god was embodied by a king, and a female vessel was chosen by the temple. These acts were believed to ensure the continued favour of the gods. What makes this all the more haunting is how normalised it became. There were stone reliefs showing the pharaoh in embrace with a goddess figure. There were hymns that praised the sweetness of the divine seed. There were prayers written by priests that described the merging of sky and earth through the union of king and woman. But beneath the poetry was a system that repurposed a woman's body into a ceremonial tool. Some scholars have debated whether the sexual component was literal. Archaeological evidence and ritual texts suggest it was. The Egyptians were not shy about representing the physical body. Fertility symbols, phallic imagery, and explicit scenes appear throughout tombs and temple walls. They did not separate the spiritual from the carnal. They believed the two were most powerful when combined. The woman at the centre of this union was expected to carry that power silently, obediently, and without resistance. No written testimony exists from these women. Their names, if recorded, are rare. Their voices are absent. What we know comes from temple records, inscriptions carved by men, and the remnants of ritual instructions passed down in scrolls. The priestess was a vessel, and like most vessels in history, she was praised in words but denied a place in the authorship of her story. Inside the temple walls, her role was sacred. Outside those walls, she returned to anonymity. Some may have become senior temple women, others faded from memory, but all shared one experience. They were chosen to perform the highest act of divine duty with a man who was not simply king, but God incarnate. Something is chilling about the precision of it all, the absence of affection, the public solemnity of a private act. The way sexuality became a ritual, and a woman's consent was never part of the equation. It was not needed. The gods had already spoken through the mouths of priests. That was enough. Reading these rituals now, I cannot help but feel that reverence often hides cruelty best when it wears the face of holiness. In the next part, we will step away from the official rituals and into the less visible chambers of the palace, where other women, such as concubines, daughters, and sisters, awaited their turn, not by divine call, but by bloodline. The official rituals that took place in temples were only part of the system. Beyond those structured ceremonies, within the thick walls of the palace itself, another layer of female service existed. These were not priestesses chosen by oracles. They were young girls selected by administrators, often taken from noble families or gifted by regional officials seeking favour. Their roles were not defined in public decrees. They entered the palace quietly and stayed indefinitely. These girls were referred to in state records as companions, servants of the divine household, or women of the residence. In modern terms, they would be called concubines. Though the meaning in ancient Egypt was far more complex, they did not serve a single purpose. They were expected to remain ready, both physically and mentally, for the moment when the pharaoh, or those acting in his name, might summon them. Some would never be called. Others would be summoned repeatedly. There was no schedule, no explanation, and certainly no refusal. They lived in dedicated wings of the palace compound. These quarters were well furnished, often more comfortable than the homes of the ordinary citizens. There were soft linens, scented baths, polished copper mirrors, and trays of dried fruit. But comfort did not equal freedom. These women were confined. Their world was limited to hallways, courtyards, and waiting. They could not leave the compound unless ordered. They could not speak openly about what happened within it. The palace harem was less a place of pleasure than a warehouse of sacred obligations. The girls underwent rigorous instruction. They learned the correct way to greet a god king. They learned to bathe in prescribed sequences, to perfume their hair with imported oils, to sit with the right posture and speak with the right tone. Their bodies were measured, watched, and monitored for signs of illness or change. Older attendants kept records of their cycles and their cleanliness. When the time came, the girls would be inspected, not just for beauty, but for purity. It was not romance, it was readiness. Most of these girls had no choice in entering this life. They were promised to the state at birth or offered in tribute by their families, who saw it as a form of social ascension. A daughter in the palace meant status, favour, and a possible link to royal blood. For the family, it was a chance. For the girl, it was a sentence without trial. Unlike the sacred marriage, which had an endpoint, these women had no defined role unless they were selected. Their existence was one long ritual of availability. If they were called, they would be cleaned, oiled, dressed in transparent linen, and escorted to a chamber. Sometimes it would be the pharaoh himself. Sometimes it would be a high official acting in ritual imitation. Either way, the act was not considered personal. It was recorded, if at all, in terms of religious significance. It is strange how a woman could be celebrated as a gift to the gods while being treated like an item on a shelf. Some girls did bear children. Those who gave birth to sons were moved to more private quarters and assigned new attendants. Their status improved, but only within the confined structure of the palace. Their sons, if recognised, might receive education and rank. Their daughters would likely return to the same system, raised for the same role, starting the cycle again. Others remained childless and nameless. They spent years without recognition, growing older in rooms that slowly lost their lustre. When they aged past desirability, they were moved to side wings, assigned duties like weaving or grinding herbs for perfumes. They were not dismissed, only relocated. The state still claimed them, though it no longer needed their bodies. There is little evidence of protest. If these women ever resisted, the records do not show it. Perhaps silence was part of survival. Perhaps the rituals had been repeated so often that no one questioned their necessity. The men in power believed they were preserving divine order. The women were never asked if they felt the same. There were exceptions, of course. A few women rose above the system. Some gained the ear of the king or bore sons who later claimed thrones. But these were rare. Most remained unnamed in history. Their presence recorded only in fragments. Graffiti on a chamber wall, a list of attendants on a funeral stele, a line in a household ledger. Their lives were invisible by design. In many ways, the concubine quarters functioned like a state-run temple, with the women as permanent offerings. Daily life was marked by discipline. Meals were scheduled, baths were supervised. The conversation was limited. Even within their group, hierarchy dictated behaviour. Senior women oversaw the younger ones. Punishments could be issued for disobedience. The threat was not violence, it was erasure. To lose your standing in the harem was to lose your future. There is a haunting rhythm to this arrangement. The blending of state, religion, and female containment created an ecosystem where sexuality became institutionalized. These women were not victims in the dramatic sense. They were not dragged or brutalized in public, but their agency was stripped quietly, covered by silk curtains and incense smoke, made acceptable through the lens of divine service. I often wonder what it felt like to live your whole life as a potential, never a person. By the time these women died, most were buried without great ceremony. Their tombs were modest if they existed at all. In rare cases, a favoured concubine might be buried in a small chamber near the royal family, but most were not remembered. They had given what was required, and the state moved on. What remains today are the physical traces. The carved images of women standing beside kings, unnamed but present. The storage jars are labelled with their chamber numbers, the cosmetic tools found in palace ruins. These fragments tell us that the women existed, though history was not built to tell their stories. The rituals continued for centuries. The names of the pharaohs changed, but the structure endured. The idea that women were offerings, not individuals, was passed down without question. It became tradition, and tradition, when old enough, becomes truth. Next, we will look deeper into the concept of purity, and how something as natural as a woman's body was turned into a source of divine anxiety. Among the many layers of control that structured a woman's existence in ancient Egypt, the issue of bodily purity stood at the centre. Cleanliness was not merely a matter of hygiene, it was treated as a spiritual measurement. A woman's body, even in its most natural and cyclic states, was expected to conform to invisible standards. The rules were not written by women. They were crafted by priests who believed that the female form needed constant supervision and restriction. The most significant example of this was the treatment of menstruation. It was not simply a private experience, it was a public limitation. A woman who was menstruating was considered temporarily impure. This impurity was not viewed as a moral failure, but it had spiritual consequences. In the eyes of temple authorities, her body was not suitable to be near the gods. Women were barred from entering sacred spaces during their cycles. They could not perform rituals, participate in festivals, or approach the altars. In some cases, they were expected to isolate themselves entirely from communal life, staying in separate rooms or designated areas until the bleeding stopped. These expectations were enforced quietly but rigidly, built into the rhythm of daily practice. If divine power could be disrupted by a natural cycle, it raises the question of how divine it truly was. No written law spelled this out in detail, but the practice was understood across Egypt. Temple manuals, purification texts, and priestly guidelines hinted at the restrictions, framing them in the language of balance and sacred cleanliness. A single drop of menstrual blood was believed to offend the presence of a deity. Whether the god actually noticed was never the point. The belief itself shaped the culture. For many women, the cycle became something to hide. Young girls were taught early on how to manage their bleeding discreetly. The materials used varied. Some used folded linen. Others relied on dried plant fibres wrapped in cloth. The goal was not comfort, it was concealment. They learned to monitor stains, to track timing, to wash away any sign that their bodies were not in a state of ceremonial readiness. The anxiety this produced ran deep. A woman who accidentally entered a temple while menstruating could bring dishonour to her household. If discovered, she might be asked to undergo cleansing rites or offer apologies in the form of incense and prayer. In some areas, her presence was believed to interfere with the effectiveness of public rituals. Priests might repeat chants, re-anoint altars, or even delay ceremonies to correct the disruption. Today, this would be like cancelling a national holiday because someone sneezed in the wrong place. Of course, not all women believed in the severity of these taboos. Some likely followed them out of habit or fear, not conviction. But the weight of collective expectation made resistance nearly impossible. The belief that menstruation was polluting did not come from nature, it came from culture, and once a culture decides that something is shameful, it does not need to enforce it with force, it enforces it through silence. What makes this more troubling is that women were never offered an explanation. There was no theology justifying why their blood was different from the blood of sacrifice. There was no open discussion about the reason one bodily function could bring blessings while another could bring restrictions. The rules existed without reason, and when something is sacred without logic, it becomes difficult to question. Some temples took the matter even further. High-ranking priestesses were sometimes expected to stop menstruating altogether. This was achieved through strict diets, extended fasting, or herbal treatments. The goal was to maintain uninterrupted access to the sacred. A body that did not bleed was considered closer to divine. A body that followed its natural course was a reminder of human limitation. women who served in temples had to track their cycles meticulously. They maintained records, sometimes shared with elder priestesses or supervising males. On days of bleeding, they might prepare incense but not light it. They might clean altars but not speak the prayers. Their presence was useful, but only from a distance. It feels quietly tragic that the same body used in rituals of fertility was treated as unclean when it proved capable of shedding blood. There are few records of how these women felt. The texts were not written by them. The carvings show silent profiles, kneeling figures, and hands offering bowls. But behind those images were women who learned to internalize a cycle of hiding. To become holy, they had to appear dry, still, and unchanging. Any sign of life that did not conform was seen as contamination. The connection between menstrual blood and impurity extended beyond the temple. In some rural beliefs, a menstruating woman was discouraged from touching bread dough, from carrying water to shrines, or from handling sacred amulets. These restrictions followed her home, into her family, and into her sense of self. Over time, the monthly cycle became more than a biological fact. It became a quiet source of shame. Some scholars argue that these taboos had practical roots, tied to hygiene or social control. Others see them as symbolic efforts to define boundaries. Either way, the effect was the same. A woman's body, acting as it was designed to do, became the reason she was kept at a distance from the divine. This did not end in childhood. Older women carried the memory of those rules long after their cycles stopped. The fear of impurity, once planted, did not fade easily. It shaped how women moved, how they spoke, how they understood their place in the sacred order. Even when no one said anything, they felt it. I think about those quiet days of isolation, the folded cloths washed in secret, the prayers whispered from thresholds rather than from within the sanctuary. It was not punishment, it was policy. And policies have a way of making people feel complicit in their exclusion. Next, we will move into the realm of divine selection, where being chosen was not always a blessing, and the most honoured women were also the most controlled. By the time a girl reached adolescence in ancient Egypt, her body had already been measured against the invisible criteria of purity, obedience, and usefulness. Some were directed into the palace, others were guided toward the temple. The temple offered a different kind of confinement. It was quiet, ceremonial, and often mistaken for reverence. But beneath the chants and incense, many women found themselves drawn into another structure of control. In certain temples, especially those dedicated to fertility deities like Min, Amun, or Hathor, a unique category of service existed. These were not general priestesses who lit lamps or prepared offerings. They were chosen specifically for rituals involving physical union. Their role was not openly described in the same terms modern readers would use, but the surviving records, carvings, and ritual texts leave little ambiguity. These women were expected to embody fertility, not just symbolically, but literally. They were known by many names depending on the region. Some were called handmaidens of the god. Others were referred to as bringers of seed, or keepers of the divine chamber. The titles were cloaked in honour, but the meaning was direct. These women were set apart, groomed, and prepared to participate in sexual rites believed to ensure agricultural abundance, human fertility, and cosmic order. When fertility rituals involve actual bodies, the line between worship and exploitation becomes remarkably thin. The ceremonies were timed with the cycles of the moon, the flooding of the Nile, or the seasonal planting calendar. During these events, the god, represented either by a high priest or the pharaoh himself, would perform the act of union with the priestess inside a specially prepared sanctuary. The space was decorated with carved papyrus stalks and woven flower garlands. Musicians played low notes on flutes, incense thickened the air. The public was not present. But the event was no secret. It was understood to be part of the divine cycle, something that allowed the land to continue. To the people, The priestess was not degraded. She was essential. She was spoken of in chants and named in processions. Her sacrifice was spiritualized. Preparation for this role took years. Girls chosen for the path began training before their first bleeding. They were taught to purify themselves daily, to speak the sacred phrases, to move with restraint. Their bodies were anointed with sacred oils made from lotus, myrrh, and cinnamon. Their hair was styled in long braids, their skin smoothed with pumice. They were not dressed in elaborate robes. During rituals, their clothing was minimal. Transparency was seen as a sign of openness to the divine. Participation in the ritual was not optional. Once selected, they could not step away. Refusal would be seen as spiritual rebellion. There are records of substitute women being brought in if the original priestess was found unworthy or unready. But the final ceremony always proceeded. It had to. The crops depended on it. The gods demanded it. Or so everyone was told. In today's world, calling this sacred would not protect it from scrutiny. In ancient Egypt, it made it unquestionable. These rites were not limited to one temple. They existed in different forms throughout the kingdom. Some involved symbolic acts using figurines or representations. Others, like the fertility rites of Min at Akhmim, were explicitly physical. The priestess would lie on a ritual bed carved with protective symbols. The god's representative would enter after purification. The act was brief, followed by offerings, hymns, and a closing chant asking for rain, growth, or children. There is no record of what the women felt. They left no writings. Their thoughts remain unknown, but their absence speaks volumes. These were not goddesses, though they were treated as such for one night. Afterward, they returned to their chambers. Some were honoured with jewellery or tokens. Others were forgotten. Their bodies were the means through which the community reached the divine. Once the contact was made, their personhood was irrelevant. Those who conceived were often moved to seclusion. The child was considered special. If male, he might be adopted by the temple or trained as a future priest. If female, she might be raised within the same system. The cycle repeated, as it often did in ancient societies that valued ritual over renewal. The temples were beautiful places. Their columns rose high. Their walls glowed with stories. Their ceilings mirrored the stars. But inside those spaces, women were asked to give more than faith. They gave their bodies, their silence, and their submission. There is something profoundly quiet about being used for worship and never being asked what you believe. The cultural logic behind these practices was consistent. Women were vessels. The gods needed vessels. The land depended on the gods. Therefore, a woman who served in this way was participating in the survival of the entire kingdom. That narrative was repeated through generations, carved into stone, sung in hymns, and whispered by elders. It left no room for dissent. Some priestesses lived their whole lives in the temple. Others were dismissed after their roles were fulfilled. A few became senior figures, teaching younger girls or managing temple storerooms. But even in higher ranks, their past were never far behind. Their value had been proven in the ritual chamber. Everything after that was an echo. The modern mind might recoil at these details, but within the structure of ancient belief, they made sense. The gods were real. The world was fragile. Every act mattered. Every offering had a cost. Women happened to be one of the most valued forms of that cost. The stone carvings still exist. You can walk through temples and see the delicate outlines of these rituals. The figures are small, the poses are stiff, but if you look closely, you will see the recurring shape of a woman lying down, her arms stretched in offering, her eyes closed, her body ready. In the next part, we will explore what happened to these women when their bodies stopped being useful to the ritual, and how divine favour could vanish once youth and fertility faded. The temples were not only concerned with what women did, they were equally interested in what women thought, and not just during the day, but also in the silence of the night. In a society where gods were believed to witness everything, even sleep became a territory of control. A woman's dreams were not her own. They could be questioned, interpreted, and even punished. Within temple complexes, especially in the houses of purification and divine preparation, dream reports were considered part of spiritual health. Some women were asked to share their dreams with elder priestesses or supervising scribes. Not all dreams were recorded, only those who strayed into dangerous territory. A vision of fire, of water running backward, of a god appearing in unfamiliar form, or worse, a dream involving touch, arousal, or a man not deemed sacred. These were called disturbances of the inner chamber, and they were treated seriously. The idea was not that a woman had sinned intentionally, but that her spirit had become unclean. Even without action, the thought itself suggested a loss of purity. If left uncorrected, it was believed that the contamination could affect the rituals, the temple space, or even draw divine disfavour. Not even sleep was sacred enough to escape religious supervision. In some temples, women who confessed to impure dreams were made to undergo light purification. This could include extra baths, recitation of cleansing hymns, or abstention from ritual duties for a period of days. In stricter environments, more invasive measures were applied. Herbal fumigations, confession to senior male priests, public acknowledgement before the goddess statue. The message was clear. What happened in the mind could be just as consequential as what happened in the body. Younger girls were warned early. Elders told them to pray before sleep, to visualize holy symbols, to keep amulets under their pillows and avoid talking about anything worldly before bedtime. It was believed that these actions could guard the gates of the mind. A restless dreamer was a risky servant. A quiet sleeper was preferable. There were even assigned dream interpreters in major religious centres. These priests and scribes claimed to read messages from the divine through the visions of others, but their assessments were not always in the dreamer's favour. If a woman reported a dream of water rising, they might call it a warning about impurity. If she dreamed of a stranger touching her, they might call it a visitation from a forbidden spirit. Modern therapists ask what your dreams say about you. Ancient priests asked what your dreams said about your loyalty. These interpretations could follow a woman for years. Even if no punishment was given, the incident could be noted, a record of inner disturbance, a red mark on a spiritual chart. Women with repeated impure dreams might be denied certain roles, passed over for rituals, seen as unstable, unpredictable, or spiritually weak. This surveillance extended to their speech. Describing a dream in too much detail could be dangerous. Speaking aloud what one saw might be construed as reliving it, reinforcing it, inviting it back. Some women learned to edit their dreams before sharing. Others kept silent, but silence too could raise suspicion. Not dreaming was seen as unnatural. Dreaming the wrong thing was seen as dangerous. There was no safe middle ground. Some temples even forbade women from sleeping in sacred spaces during their cycle, or after certain ceremonies. It was believed that the vulnerability of sleep made them more susceptible to spiritual invasion. They might be visited by the wrong energy. They might see what they were not supposed to see. In extreme cases, women who dreamed repeatedly of forbidden acts were believed to be carrying inner demons. These were not metaphorical. The priests believed in literal spirits that clung to thoughts, entered dreams, and influenced behaviour. Special chants were composed to expel such presences. Some women were made to wear protective bindings at night, strips of linen marked with sacred symbols, wrapped around the chest or forehead. These were not for health. They were spiritual locks. The emotional toll of this system cannot be easily measured. These women lived in spaces where even the mind was not safe. Privacy was a foreign concept. Dreams, normally a place of escape or processing, became just another surface to keep clean. The self had to be managed 24 hours a day. It unsettles me to think that a place as quiet and intimate as a dream could be turned into a stage for guilt, There is no evidence that the men overseeing these regulations were subjected to the same scrutiny. Pharaohs had prophetic dreams. Priests had divine visions. But women's dreams were filtered through the lens of suspicion. They were not revelations. They were risks. They were not messages. They were liabilities. Some girls probably learned to tell only harmless stories. Dreams of light, of clouds, of goddesses smiling. Others likely stopped remembering altogether. A defense mechanism, a way to keep themselves safe from interpretation. And yet the rules persisted. Generation after generation, women continued to sleep under the gaze of unseen authority. Not every temple enforced the same level of control, but the belief in dream purity never disappeared. It stayed, quiet and heavy, folded into the linen sheets and oil-scented air. The only freedom left was forgetting, and even that came with its unease. Unlike the rituals that left physical marks or records, these mental restrictions left behind almost nothing. No carvings, no scrolls, no tomb reliefs, only the absence of stories. The silence of women who learned not to speak of what they saw when their eyes were closed. Our next look will not be into dreams, but into the waking hierarchy of the royal household, where a woman's bloodline determined whether she would be embraced, ignored, or erased. In temples across Egypt, stories were not simply told for entertainment. They were preserved as warnings, models, and guidelines for human behaviour. The myths carved into stone were more than religious memory. They were instructed. And among these myths, few carried such a pointed message for women as the tale of Sekhmet. Sekhmet was not a passive goddess. She was fierce, radiant, and fully capable of destruction. Created by the god Ra to punish humanity when it grew disobedient, she swept across the earth with flames in her eyes and blood on her mouth. Her presence was unstoppable. Her rage was divine. She did not ask. She acted. But as the myth goes, her power became too great. She began to enjoy the destruction. Her fury did not fade. Ra, alarmed by what he had unleashed, decided that something had to be done. Not through reason, not through dialogue, through intoxication. He ordered jugs of red-dyed beer to be poured over the land, creating pools that looked like blood. Sekhmet drank deeply. She thought it was the remains of her conquest. Instead, it was a trap. It seems the oldest solution to a powerful woman was to make her too dizzy to keep going. She fell asleep, lulled into a stupor. When she awoke, her rage was gone. She was changed. Some say she became Hathor, the gentler form, associated with love and fertility. Others say she remained Sekhmet, but tamed, manageable, and only called upon when needed. Either way, the story ends not with her triumph, but with her neutralization. This myth was told and retold, not just to explain the seasons or cosmic balance, but to model obedience. It framed the uncontrolled female force as a threat. It framed submission as salvation. The message was not subtle. Women who were too powerful needed to be softened. They could still serve, but not in full force. They had to be transformed before they could be accepted. Priestesses across Egypt honoured Sekhmet with daily offerings. She was feared and revered. But the version of her that was celebrated was the version after the wine, the tamed lioness, the healed destroyer. Her statues show her seated, calm, holding an ankh, her lion face serene. Rarely do they depict the Sekhmet who refused to listen. In some temple rituals, wine played a central role. It was poured as an offering. It was consumed during festivals. During the festival of drunkenness, women danced, laughed, and drank to honour the calming of Sekhmet. Beneath the joy was a lesson. Drunkenness was not just a celebration, it was control. It was what turned a goddess from a weapon into a wife. If a god had to drug his creation to keep the world in balance, perhaps the world was built with imbalance at its core. The myth bled into expectations for real women, those who expressed anger, independence, or resistance were often framed as dangerous. In temple stories and domestic wisdom, too much emotion, too much energy, too much voice could lead to chaos. A good woman, like Sekhmet after the drink, was one who had been softened, not eliminated, just dulled. There were amulets sold to women to protect against female fire. These charms were meant to ease the body, calm the mind, reduce heat, and reduce restlessness. Herbs were prescribed not just for cramps or childbirth, but for mood. A restless wife might be given cooling teas. A loud daughter might be kept indoors during the full moon. It was not called punishment. It was balanced. Among noble families, girls were taught early how to manage their tone. Speech was watched. Gaze was trained. Even laughter had to be soft. The myth of Sekhmet hovered behind these lessons. Everyone knew what happened to the woman who burned too brightly. Some versions of the myth add a layer of guilt. Sekhmet, upon waking and realizing what she had done, weeps. Her sorrow becomes the Nile flood, a cleansing of past violence. This reinterpretation casts her not just as tamed, but ashamed. It completes the transformation. Not only must the wild woman be stopped, she must regret ever being wild. It always unsettles me how mythology can be used to flatten the very power it pretends to honour. Despite the layers of symbolism, the lesson was absorbed in daily life, in temples, festivals, and family stories. Women were reminded that power without control was unacceptable. Passion without structure was dangerous. Even divinity had to be diluted if it came in a female form. Sekhmet remained a goddess of healing and protection. She was prayed to in times of plague, honoured by doctors and midwives. But even in those roles, her fierceness was harnessed for others, not herself. Her original autonomy was a distant echo, remembered only in the earliest lines of the myth. The stone walls of Egyptian temples preserve her name in thousands of places, but the story most often told is not how she acted, but how she stopped. That detail, more than any other, reveals what kind of woman the culture felt safe to worship. Not the woman who roared, but the one who fell asleep. Next time, we will not look to the heavens or the myths. We will stay inside the palace and follow the path of bloodlines, where being born into the right womb meant being prepared for the king's bed. After myths had taught women what not to be, rituals were built to define what they should become, and at the heart of these definitions stood one concept repeated across temples, households, and generations' virginity. It was not just a physical condition, it was a symbol of purity, worth, and spiritual eligibility. Without it, a woman could not step into the sacred roles assigned to her. With it, she became a vessel prepared for divine purpose. In many temple communities, girls selected for priestess duties were required to be virgins. This was not simply a preference, it was a mandate. The act of preserving the untouched body was seen as an offering to the gods, a pure container, a clean slate. From the moment a girl was chosen, her life was managed with this goal in mind. Everything she touched, wore, or consumed was measured to ensure that no impurity entered her body. That included other people. She lived under supervision, even within the temple walls. Older women oversaw her routines. She bathed at specific hours, used specific cloths, and wore garments that revealed nothing. Her exposure to men, even male priests, was limited. Her voice was monitored, her movements were tracked. The risk of accidental corruption, even imagined, was unacceptable. It is remarkable how entire institutions were built around the idea of keeping one small part of a woman's body untouched. The hymns she memorized included verses about spiritual cleanliness. The chants she repeated reminded her that her worth was in her restraint. To desire was not forbidden, but to act on it, or even to think too freely, was considered the first crack in the seal. Purity was not only about anatomy, it was about attitude. A girl who seemed too bold, too curious, too open, could be deemed unworthy, even if her body remained technically untouched. Before major rituals, some temples conducted inspections. These were not recorded in detail, but writings suggest that women underwent physical examinations to ensure they were still intact. This practice was framed as sacred, guided by priestesses or midwives. The girl was not allowed to object. Her body belonged to the god she would serve. The purpose of all this was not modesty. It was ownership. When a woman entered a divine marriage, whether to a god in ritual or to the pharaoh himself, her virginity was presented as part of the ceremony. It elevated the union. It made it special. A first time given not to a partner, but to a system. In some ways, the obsession with virginity in ancient Egypt mirrors the modern impulse to value silence over experience in women. If a girl lost her virginity outside the sanctioned system, the consequences were severe. She might be removed from temple service, her name might be erased from records. In rare cases, her family would suffer dishonour. No one asked about consent. If the loss was forced, the stigma remained. The act itself mattered more than the context. Some girls, fearing expulsion, attempted to hide what had happened. They used herbs believed to tighten the body. They prayed to minor deities for forgiveness. There are even scattered mentions of blood substitutes used during ritual bedding to simulate the expected sign. These measures were risky. If discovered, the deception brought worse penalties than the act itself. Yet the pressure was so intense that silence and danger seemed preferable to honesty. This standard was not universal. In rural areas, practices varied. Some goddesses, especially those associated with birth and sexuality, allowed for married priestesses or mothers among their servants. But in the main cults, the expectation of virginity held firm, and with it came the deep fear of being found spoiled. Even in daily life, virginity shaped how girls were treated. Marriage contracts often included statements about the bride's status. A woman who could prove her virginity brought a greater dowry. A man who accused his wife of being impure could demand compensation if he had evidence. In all these transactions, the woman's word held little weight. It is difficult not to see the entire concept as a tool for measuring obedience rather than virtue. What remained after years of this conditioning was a kind of internalized vigilance. Girls learned to monitor themselves, not just their actions, but their feelings. They avoided eye contact. They silenced their questions. They prayed for strength, not just from temptation, but from fear. Some never knew what it meant to feel free in their skin. Older priestesses, having passed through these expectations, often became enforcers of them. They did not always act out of cruelty. For many, it was the only path they had known. They believed in the rules because the rules had kept them safe, respected, or at least invisible. And invisibility was sometimes preferable to disgrace. Even in death, the ideal persisted. Tombs of high-ranking temple women sometimes bore inscriptions emphasizing their virginity. It was listed alongside their name and titles, as if it were an achievement. In a sense, it was. It meant they had survived the system without falling outside it. They had remained untouched, unchallenged, and remembered. Today, what survives are the traces of these ideals, in carvings, in papyri, in ritual texts. The word itself is rarely used, but the framework is clear. Purity was the condition for access. Without it, a woman could not enter the sacred. She could not serve the gods. She could not serve the king. She could not even serve her history. The requirement was never about biology. It was about control. And once internalized, that control did not need to be enforced. It became self-sustaining. But systems built on fear often leave behind cracks. And through those cracks, other stories sometimes emerged. In the next part, we will follow the lives of royal women whose bloodlines guaranteed privilege, but whose destinies still lay beneath the shadow of the king's will. In ancient Egypt, the female body was not only measured by what it preserved, but by what it could produce. Virginity might open the gate to sacred service, but childbirth determined whether a woman could remain inside it. and not just any child. Only sons were seen as the true fulfillment of divine potential. Daughters were tolerated, sons were required. This expectation weighed most heavily on the women closest to the throne. A royal concubine or queen might be chosen for her beauty, bloodline, or ritual purity. But once chosen, her purpose narrowed. She was expected to conceive, and not just once, repeatedly, preferably with at least one male heir. Without this result, all her other qualities faded in importance. Her spiritual value was tied to her womb, and her success was counted in sons. For women in temple households, the standard was similar. Priestesses who broke their vows and entered into sexual unions, whether sanctioned or not, were watched closely. If a pregnancy occurred, its outcome determined their status. A boy could be celebrated as a possible future scribe or servant of the temple. A girl might be passed quietly into the domestic wing, but no child at all meant failure, not only of the body, but of the soul. In a system where creation was sacred, infertility became a quiet kind of blasphemy. Women who failed to bear sons were often removed from their roles. This removal was rarely public. There were no announcements, no trials. They were simply reassigned, sent to outlying temple buildings, given duties that required no contact with sacred objects or rituals. Their names might remain on official rosters, but their presence faded. They moved through shadowed halls, no longer essential. Some were sent to live in secluded quarters. These residences were sometimes referred to as houses of retreat. There, the women continued to serve in minor ways, preparing linens or assisting with records. But they did not participate in public rituals. They did not appear in processions. Their absence was understood as a consequence of spiritual deficiency. For royal women, the consequences were sharper. A queen consort who failed to produce a male heir might be replaced. Not in the title, perhaps, but in favour. Another wife, more fertile or more fortunate, would rise in prominence. The first queen might be relocated to a distant palace, her staff reduced, her chambers reassigned. She might still wear royal garments, but only behind closed doors. Sometimes these women attempted to claim spiritual explanations. They would fast, pray, and offer sacrifices to fertility goddesses. They would sleep with amulets under their pillows, drink sacred infusions, bathe in river water gathered at dawn. But biology did not bend to devotion, and the gods, silent as always, gave no response. It is strangely modern how failure to meet an expectation in one area can erase a lifetime of devotion in all others. There were whispers of blame. Some said the women had broken a vow. Others claimed their hearts were impure. A few accused them of being cursed. The truth mattered less than the result. Without a son, a woman's position was always at risk, no matter her lineage, no matter her former favour. Even women who bore only daughters were treated with suspicion. Though daughters could serve in temples or marry well, they did not continue the father's name or authority. A royal line without a son was seen as spiritually unstable. The dynasty relied on visible continuity. That meant a male child, healthy and legitimate, born of the right mother at the right time. Some women tried to hide failed pregnancies. They claimed false conceptions or prolonged illness. They dressed to conceal their figures, delayed announcements, and prayed for second chances. But the palace was full of eyes, attendants, midwives, astrologers. Word always spread. Those who did bear sons gained temporary security, but even then, the child's survival was uncertain. Infant mortality was high. A woman who celebrated too soon might mourn in silence days later, and with each lost child, her standing weakened. The burden was not shared equally. Men were rarely blamed for childlessness. If a union failed to produce an heir, the assumption rested on the woman. She became the cracked vessel, the barren field, the blocked channel. The language was poetic, the consequences were not. Some of these women lived long lives in isolation. They were cared for, but not consulted, fed, but not honoured. Their rooms were decorated with older symbols. Their names appeared less frequently in records. Time erased their status slowly, without noise. I often think about the silence of those corridors, where women waited for redemption that would never come. There are no temples to these women, no statues, no prayers composed in their name. Their lives became footnotes in the stories of others. Their images, if preserved at all, appear in background carvings, carrying trays, or watching from doorways. They were not forgotten entirely, but they were reshaped, from central figures to minor ones, from vessels of power to symbols of what not to become. Their fertility, or lack thereof, rewrote their legacy. And yet they continued. They served where they could. They taught the younger girls. They remembered the rituals. They maintained their hair and posture and voice. Even without sons, they carried the discipline they were taught, not because it brought a reward, but because it was all they had ever known. Their presence lingers in the architecture, empty side chambers, retired garments, notes in old inventories. Their stories were never told, but they existed between the lines, where blood did not flow, power did not follow. And in that absence, entire lives were quietly set aside. What came next was no easier. Even for the women who bore sons, the rules did not relax. They simply changed shape. In the following part, we will see how divine favour could turn into divine suspicion, and how the mother of a prince could still be treated like a liability. Inside temple walls, devotion was not always expressed through prayer. Sometimes it was carved, sometimes it was burned, sometimes it was inked into the skin of a woman who would never again belong to herself. She was not punished. She was not enslaved. She was honoured, they said. But the marks on her body told a quieter truth. Once chosen, she was no longer simply a person. She became a surface for divine use. Religious tattooing was practiced across many regions of ancient Egypt, especially among priestesses who served deities linked to fertility and protection. These were not decorations. They were signs of a spiritual assignment. The markings were placed with purpose. Across the chest, along the lower belly, down the arms, symbols of life, rebirth, healing, and power. A lotus in bloom, an eye watching, a series of protective dots like a net across the ribs. There were no mirrors in the ceremony room. The woman did not need to see what was being done. She already knew what it meant. From the moment she was selected, her future narrowed. She had entered a contract that was not written in ink but delivered by priests, and now her body would carry the text of that agreement. It is difficult to call a body sacred when it cannot say no. The process was simple but painful. A small needle made of bone or bronze pierced the skin repeatedly. The pigment came from natural soot, mixed with oils or crushed minerals, sometimes red, sometimes black. The wound was left open, exposed to the temple air, as proof that she had endured it willingly. There was no allowance for fear or resistance. Crying was frowned upon. Movement was discouraged. The less reaction, the stronger the devotion. After the ritual, she was cleansed again, anointed with oils, dressed in plain linen, taken back to her chamber to rest. A senior priestess would check the ink in the following days, ensuring it held. If the lines faded or bled too much, the tattoo might be reapplied. The expectation was permanence, a mark that could not be washed away with water or time. For some, this was a source of pride. They believed their bodies had become vessels of divine attention. The markings gave them status within the temple. They were called by new titles, given new roles, and sometimes even permitted to lead rituals. But the mark was also a boundary. It told others that her body was no longer for private love, for personal choice, or anything outside the service of her god. It is strangely familiar how quickly sacred roles can become cages, once painted in permanence. There were different methods across Egypt. In some temples, the tattoos were replaced with brands, a heated symbol pressed against the thigh or shoulder, leaving a scar raised in relief. These were often shaped like the symbol of the goddess they served. Branding was more extreme, but in some regions it was considered more binding. Ink could fade,